The invitation was slipped under my apartment door on a Tuesday morning, and I almost threw it away thinking it was junk mail. It wasn't junk mail. It was cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering, thick enough that it felt expensive just sitting between my fingers. The Hargrove Foundation Annual Gala. Friday, 8 p.m. Formal attire required. And below that, handwritten in ink so dark it looked almost black. Bring her. G. I found out later, from Marcus, one of the drivers who sometimes felt sorry enough for me to talk, that they'd been laughing about it in the elevator. Gunwoo's men. 3 of them, apparently, cracking jokes about what the cleaning girl would show up wearing. Whether she'd borrow something from a department store, whether she'd even know what black tie meant. I wasn't the cleaning girl. I was the building manager for the residential tower on 54th Street that one of Gunwoo's shell companies technically owned. I handled maintenance requests, vendor contracts, tenant complaints. I'd been doing it for 2 years without ever speaking more than 12 words to the man who, according to the paperwork, didn't even exist in any meaningful capacity within the building's ownership structure. But I'd seen him. Everyone in that building had seen him, even if they pretended otherwise. He was hard to miss, and harder to look at for too long. Not because he was unpleasant to look at, which would have made things considerably easier for me, but because of the opposite problem entirely. Gunwoo was the kind of man whose face made you feel caught doing something wrong. Sharp features, dark eyes that moved slowly and noticed everything, black hair swept back with the kind of effortless precision that felt almost insulting. He was always in a suit. Always. I'd never seen him in anything casual, not once. Not even at 9 in the morning when normal people existed in the world wearing sweatpants. And his neck. The tattoos that climbed from his collarbone upward. Dark and intricate, and deliberately visible when his collar sat open. Those were somehow the most unsettling thing about him. Not because they looked dangerous, though they did, but because they suggested a version of him that existed before all the control. Before whatever stillness he'd built around himself like a wall. I'd seen the way people moved around him. How the lobby went quiet when he stepped off the elevator. How his own security, 4 men minimum, always, kept a specific distance. Close enough to act, but far enough not to crowd him. He didn't need to raise his voice. I'd never once heard him raise his voice. People just adjusted, shifted, made space that he hadn't asked for but always received. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days. I should have ignored it. I knew that. The rational part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through a finance degree at a state school on scholarships and loans, through 2 years of unglamorous work in property management, through every version of being underestimated that a black woman in corporate-adjacent spaces gets served on a daily basis. That part told me to leave it alone. It was a joke. The handwriting proved it. Bring her. Not even my name. Just her. Like I was a prop someone had thought to include at the last second for entertainment value. But there was another part of me. A quieter, more stubborn part that I didn't always like admitting to. And that part sat with the invitation and thought, fine. It took me until Thursday morning to call my cousin Renee, who worked in wardrobe and production for a styling house in Midtown that occasionally dealt in high-end loans for editorial and event purposes. I explained the situation poorly, leaving out the parts that were genuinely alarming, and focused on the part where I needed a dress by Friday evening and had essentially no budget for it. Renee was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Sophia, who exactly invited you to this thing? My employer. Kind of. It's complicated. Another pause. I heard her exhale slowly, the way she did when she was deciding whether to ask more questions or just do the thing. She did the thing. Come in tomorrow at noon. I'll have something pulled. What she pulled, I was not prepared for. I stood in the fitting room at 1:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon, looking at myself in a mirror, while Renee stood behind me with an expression I couldn't read, and I genuinely could not process what I was seeing. The dress was deep midnight blue, almost black until the light caught it, and then it shifted. Subtle, like the surface of water in a dark room. Floor length, long sleeves, high neck. Nothing overtly revealing, and yet somehow the most commanding thing I'd ever worn. The fabric moved like it had an opinion about things. "Renee," I said carefully. "What is this dress?" "It's a Maison Alaya archive piece," she said. "Modified. There's additional work in the beading. Hand-sewn. Took a team 4 months." She paused. "It's on loan from a private collector." "How much is it worth?" She met my eyes in the mirror. "You don't need to know that." "Renee." She straightened a seam at my shoulder with unnecessary focus. 2 million, approximately. Give or take. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I can't wear this." "You're already wearing it." "I mean, I shouldn't wear this. What if I spill something? What if—" "Sophia." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. She put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me in the mirror with the kind of directness that only people who have known you since childhood can manage. "You said someone invited you as a joke." "Yes." "Then stop giving them the punchline." The car that arrived for me at 7:40 p.m. was not something I'd arranged. I was standing outside my building in the dress, with a wrap Renee had added last minute, simple black, which I was clutching like a lifeline, when a black Escalade pulled to the curb, and a man I vaguely recognized as part of Gunwoo's security detail stepped out and opened the rear door without a word. I looked at the open door. I looked at the man holding it. He stared straight ahead, neither welcoming nor hostile, just waiting with the patience of someone who had been told to wait and had decided that meant indefinitely. I got in. The interior was dark and quiet, and smelled faintly of cedar. I sat rigidly in the back seat and watched Midtown pass by outside the tinted windows, trying to keep my breathing even. There was no one else in the car. Gunwoo was not there, which was both a relief and— I didn't examine this part closely. Something else. The Gala was at the Whitmore Hotel, a venue I'd walked past 100 times but never entered. The kind of place that existed at a frequency slightly above ordinary life, where the doormen wore white gloves and the flower arrangements in the lobby cost more than my monthly rent. When the Escalade stopped and the door opened again, I could hear music already drifting from somewhere inside, low and formal, and I could see the photographers positioned outside, and the clusters of people in gowns and tuxedos moving through the entrance like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stepped out. I don't know what I expected to feel. Ridiculous, probably. Out of place. Like someone who had borrowed someone else's life for the evening and couldn't quite figure out how the collar sat. Instead, something strange happened. A woman near the entrance, early 50s, in red, clearly someone, turned and looked at me. Then the man beside her turned. Then the photographer closest to the door shifted his camera. I kept walking. The wrap was still in my hands. I didn't put it on. Inside, past the marble foyer and the second set of doors, the main hall opened up into something out of a different era. High ceilings, chandeliers casting everything in amber, round tables draped in white linen spread across a floor that could have held 4 of my apartment. Hundreds of people. Wait staff moving through with practiced invisibility. The kind of room where power wasn't announced. It just gathered. I stood at the top of the 2 steps leading down into the hall and scanned the room once, looking for nothing specific. And that was when I found him. Or rather, and this was the part I couldn't explain cleanly afterward, that was when I realized he had already found me. Gunwoo was standing near the far end of the room with 2 men I didn't recognize, a glass in his hand that he hadn't touched, and his eyes were on me with an expression I had absolutely no framework for reading. Not surprise, exactly. Not amusement. Something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things, like a calculation being adjusted in real time. He didn't move. He didn't smile. The 2 men beside him, mid-sentence about something, gradually stopped talking. I stood at the top of those 2 steps for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 4 seconds, holding the wrap in my hands, in a $2 million dress, staring back at the man who had invited me here as a joke. And I thought, okay, Sophia, don't you dare look away first. I didn't. He looked away first. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone else in that room would have noticed or catalogued. It was a small thing. His chin tilted slightly downward, his attention shifted toward the man on his left who had resumed talking, and the moment closed like a door being shut with careful, deliberate quietness. But I noticed. I noticed because I had been watching with everything I had, braced for something I couldn't name, and when it happened, it left me with an odd feeling sitting in my chest. Not victory, exactly. Something more complicated and less comfortable than that. I descended the 2 steps into the hall and told myself to breathe normally. A waiter appeared at my elbow almost immediately with a tray of champagne, and I took a glass more out of reflex than desire, giving my hands something to do. The room was loud in that particular way that expensive rooms get loud. Layered conversations, crystal touching crystal, the orchestra threading underneath everything like a current. I moved through it slowly, staying near the edges, trying to get my bearings. No one had told me which table I was at. No one had told me anything, really. The invitation had given me a time and a dress code and nothing else, and the driver who'd collected me hadn't offered information. And now I was standing in the middle of one of the most prominent charity galas in Manhattan, holding champagne I wasn't drinking, wearing a dress worth more than most people's cars, and I had genuinely no idea what I was supposed to do next. What I did was find a spot near one of the tall windows overlooking 61st Street and stay there for a while, watching. Watching was something I was good at. It had always been a survival skill more than a hobby. The ability to read a room, track the hierarchies, identify who deferred to whom and why. In property management, it was useful. In life, it was necessary. And in this room, within about 10 minutes of careful observation, certain things became clear. The tables near the center were the important ones. The people occupying them moved with the relaxed confidence of those who had never once worried about whether they belonged somewhere. Politicians, finance people. A few faces I recognized from news cycles I half remembered. They laughed easily and leaned into each other's space the way people do when they're comfortable with power. And then there was Gunwoo's orbit. It wasn't a table exactly. It was a gravitational arrangement. He moved through the room, slowly, without urgency, and people rotated around him in ways they probably weren't conscious of. Men straightened slightly when he passed. Conversations paused. Women watched him with a specific kind of attention that they tried and mostly failed to make look casual. His security detail adjusted with him, that practiced distance maintained like geometry. He didn't seem to notice any of it, or he noticed all of it, and had simply decided it wasn't worth acknowledging. I couldn't tell which, and that uncertainty bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I was still watching him. Not obviously, I told myself, just peripherally. When someone stepped into my space from the left and said brightly, "I don't think we've met. I'm Cassandra Whitfield." I turned. She was white, mid-30s, blonde in the way that suggested significant maintenance, in a pale gold dress that was beautiful, and somehow also slightly aggressive about being beautiful. She was smiling with the particular warmth of someone who had been told their smile was an asset, and had taken that information seriously. "Sophia," I said. "Sophia Green. Are you with the Hargrove Foundation?" "No, I'm a guest." Her smile held. "Of course. And who brought you tonight?" The question was perfectly pleasant and entirely pointed. I took a small sip of my champagne. "I received an invitation," I said, which was true, and answered nothing. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not rudeness, but a recalibration. She was trying to place me. I watched her doing it and said nothing helpful. After a moment, she pivoted gracefully to something else, a comment about the venue, the flowers, something I responded to in the appropriate places while most of my attention stayed carefully distributed around the room. She excused herself after a few minutes. I exhaled slowly. That was when I noticed the shift. It was subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying the kind of attention I was paying. Across the room, one of Gunwoo's men, the one I usually saw stationed near the 54th Street building's parking level, broad-shouldered, expressionless in the way of people who practiced it, was angling slightly in my direction, not approaching, just reorienting, the way a camera adjusts its focus. I looked away from him and found, without intending to, that I was looking directly at Gunwoo again. He was closer than he'd been before. Not close enough that it was deliberate, or not obviously deliberate. Maybe 30 feet, speaking to an older man in a gray tuxedo who was doing most of the talking. But his eyes cut to me for just a second, brief and clean, before returning to the man in front of him. My pulse did something irritating. I turned back toward the window. The orchestra had shifted into something slower, and a portion of the floor near the far wall had cleared for dancing. I watched couples move through the space with varying degrees of skill and self-consciousness, and I told myself I was fine. I was perfectly composed. I was a woman in a beautiful dress at a gala, and none of this was as strange as it felt. Then a voice came from just behind my right shoulder, low and even without preamble. "You're standing in the corner." I turned. Gunwoo was there. Closer than 30 feet now, considerably closer. And I realized with a small internal lurch that his security had positioned itself at a distance that created, without being obvious about it, a slight buffer around the two of us. The nearest guests were engaged elsewhere. The pocket of space felt deliberate in a way I didn't know how to respond to. He was looking at me with that same unreadable quality he'd had from across the room, except that up close it was more difficult to dismiss. His eyes were very dark. The tattoos at his throat were partly visible where his collar sat open. 2 buttons, no tie. And I was aware, in the specific way you become aware of things you'd rather not be, of exactly how composed he was. How completely, almost unnervingly still. "I know," I said. He didn't say anything to that. He looked at me for a moment, and then, for just a second, his gaze moved down and back up, not in a way that was disrespectful, just in the way of someone taking full inventory of something that had surprised them. "The dress," he said. It wasn't a question. "Is a problem?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "No," he said. Then quieter. "No, it isn't." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like it contained things neither of us was going to say right now, and we both understood that, and it was somehow worse than if he'd just spoken them. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either." "Why did you?" I considered lying. I considered something smooth and self-possessed. What I said instead was, because it seemed like the right answer to the question being asked. He was quiet. The orchestra played something with a cello running under it, low and sustained. Around us, the room continued its elaborate performance of itself, and no one was looking directly at us. And yet I had the distinct and not entirely irrational feeling that somehow, peripherally, some significant portion of that room was aware of exactly where Gunwoo was standing and who was next to him. "You know what they said," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was flatter than that. A statement, placed between us without decoration. "Yes." He nodded once, very slightly, like the answer confirmed something. "You should eat something," he said then. "They're moving to dinner." It was such an ordinary thing to say that for a second I didn't know how to respond to it. He wasn't wrong. Somewhere behind me, staff were beginning the quiet orchestration of guiding guests toward tables, but the mundaneness of it after everything else felt almost disorienting. "Okay," I said. "You're at my table." He said it the way you state a fact about geography. Not an invitation, not a warning, just information. I looked at him. He was already turning slightly, and one of his men materialized at a respectful distance to his left, with the practiced timing of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Gunwoo didn't look back to see if I was following. He didn't need to. I followed. And as I moved through that room beside him, not touching careful space between us, the dress catching the light of the chandeliers in that dark waterway it had, I was aware of the conversations that quieted as we passed, the glances. Cassandra Whitfield, somewhere to my left, watching with an expression she hadn't bothered to neutralize. The weight of the room adjusting around him the way it always did, except now it was adjusting around me too. And that was something I hadn't been ready for. I wasn't sure I was ready for it now, but I kept walking. Dinner at Gunwoo's table was an education in silence. There were 8 seats. 6 of them were occupied by people I didn't know. 2 men who looked like lawyers or financial advisors, the kind whose faces gave nothing away professionally. A Korean couple in their 50s who spoke mostly to each other in low voices. And 2 women who arrived together and spent most of the meal looking at their phones with the bored elegance of people who attended these things so frequently they'd stopped pretending to enjoy them. No one introduced themselves to me. No one was rude about it either. It was more that my presence was acknowledged the way weather is acknowledged. Noted, accepted, incorporated into the existing understanding of things without commentary. Gunwoo sat to my left. That was the detail that made the whole evening strange in a way I couldn't fully metabolize. Not across the table. Not at a safe, manageable distance. To my left, close enough that when the waiter reached between us to set down the first course, I was briefly aware of the warmth coming off him, and the faint cedar and something else that I recognized from the car, and hadn't let myself think about since. He spoke to the men across the table occasionally. Brief, quiet exchanges that I didn't always catch fully, some of it in English and some of it not. He didn't ignore me exactly. He was simply attentive in a way that didn't announce itself. When my water glass was getting low, it was refilled before I noticed. When the conversation across the table turned to something involving a property development on the Lower East Side, and one of the men glanced at me with the evaluating look of someone wondering if I should be hearing this, Gunwoo's attention shifted toward him by approximately 3 degrees, and the man looked back at his plate. That was it. 3 degrees. No words. I ate my salmon and tried to look like someone who attended galas regularly. "You're quiet," Gunwoo said, between the first and second course. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. His gaze was somewhere across the room, but it was clearly directed at me. "So are you," I said. He turned his head then. That look again, the one that felt like being read in a language I didn't speak but was starting to recognize the rhythms of. "That's different," he said. "How?" He considered this, which surprised me. I'd expected him to either drop it or say something that shut the conversation down cleanly. Instead, he seemed to actually think about it for a second. "I'm quiet because I'm listening," he said finally. "You're quiet because you're deciding something." I didn't answer that. Partly because I didn't have a good answer. Partly because he was more right than I was comfortable with. What I was deciding, somewhere underneath the performance of composure I was maintaining, was whether to be angry. I'd been holding that question at arm's length since Tuesday, since the moment Marcus had told me about the laughter in the elevator, with the apologetic half-shrug of a man who felt bad, but not bad enough to have said anything at the time. The invitation as a joke. Bring her. The implicit assumption that I would either not come, or come in a way that confirmed whatever the joke was supposed to prove. And now, I was here. At his table. In $2 million of borrowed midnight blue silk. And instead of feeling triumphant about that, which had been the plan vaguely, I mostly felt like I was standing at the edge of something I hadn't looked down at yet. The second course arrived. The conversation across the table resumed. Why did you actually invite me? I asked. I kept my voice low even, the same tone I used when I was raising a maintenance concern with a contractor who I suspected was overcharging. Neutral, direct. He picked up his fork without urgency. I wanted to see what you'd do. With the invitation? Yes. I looked at him. That's it? You wanted to see what I'd do? Most people in your position would have ignored it, he said, or shown up trying to be invisible. You did neither. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation. With Gunwoo, those seemed to occupy the same territory. And the people who thought it was funny? I asked. Did you want to see what they'd do too? Something shifted in his jaw, barely perceptible, but there. That's being handled, he said. The flatness of it sent a small chill through me. Not fear exactly, but a reminder of what I was sitting next to. What this man was. Underneath the suit and the controlled quiet and the cedar smell and the way he'd refilled my water without making a production of it. I had a habit, I realized, of letting details like those sand down the edges of what I knew to be true. It was a dangerous habit. It doesn't need to be handled, I said. It was disrespectful. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. But the word landed with a weight that made the air around it feel different. In my presence, toward someone under my roof, that needs to be handled. Under my roof. The phrase settled over me strangely. Not threatening. He wasn't threatening me. That much I was sure of. But possessive in a way that I didn't know what to do with. A kind of ownership that wasn't cruel, but also wasn't asking permission. I put my fork down. I'm not under your roof, I said carefully. I work in a building that your company owns. That's a professional relationship with a clearly defined boundary. He looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said. And then said nothing else, and returned to his food with the perfect patience of a man who has said exactly what he intended to say, and sees no need to add to it. I didn't know what to do with that, yes. Whether it was agreement or something else entirely. Dessert came and went. The orchestra shifted back into something livelier, and the dance floor filled again, and the room loosened in the way rooms do when people have had 2 hours of food and wine, and the formalities have started to blur at the edges. The 2 women who'd spent dinner on their phones disappeared. The lawyers or financial advisors shook Gunwoo's hand in turn and left. The Korean couple departed with a warmth toward him that was the most human thing I'd seen directed at him all evening. The older woman touched his arm briefly, said something I didn't catch, and he inclined his head with a respect that looked genuine and unperformed. I found myself thinking, he has people who matter to him. It was a stupid thing to be surprised by. And yet, dance with me. I turned. He was already standing, and the request, if it was a request, which syntactically it barely was, had been delivered with the same quiet certainty as everything else he said. Not demanding exactly, just operating on an assumption of yes. Every sensible instinct I had said no. Said this is already further than you intended to go tonight, Sophia. Said remember where you are and who you're with, and that this is not a story that ends somewhere comfortable. I stood up. The floor had a comfortable density of couples, enough that we weren't conspicuous. He led without making a show of it, one hand at my waist, proper distance, nothing that crossed a line. And I rested my hand on his shoulder and felt, through the layers of his jacket, how still he held himself. Like stillness was the one thing he'd decided to be perfect at a very long time ago. We moved through the first few bars without speaking. Then he said, quietly, close enough that it was meant only for me, "You were watching me earlier, before dinner." "You were watching me first," I said. He didn't deny it. "Yes," he said. Again that singular word that seemed to contain more than it gave away. The music turned, and we turned with it. And for a moment I could see the room from a different angle. And I saw, in the shifting crowd, The man I recognized from the parking level standing near the edge of the floor. Watching. Not us specifically, just the room, scanning with the practiced attention of his role. And then I saw Cassandra Whitfield. She was at a table 15 feet away, champagne in hand, watching our direction with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something more unguarded. Something that looked, if I was reading it right, like she was revising a significant number of assumptions simultaneously. I looked back at Gunwoo. "People are going to talk," I said. "People always talk," he said. "About this specifically." His hand at my waist adjusted slightly, not tighter exactly, but more settled, more deliberate. "Let them," he said. And the thing that frightened me wasn't the words. The thing that frightened me was how, for just a second, I almost agreed with him. The night ended without incident, which somehow made everything worse. There was no dramatic moment, no confrontation, nothing I could point to afterward and say that was where things shifted. Gunwoo walked me to the car at 11:15 with 2 of his men at a discreet distance behind us, and the midtown air was cool enough that I was glad for the wrap, and he said nothing for most of the walk through the lobby, except to nod once at a man who greeted him near the door. Outside, the Escalade was already there. The driver had the door open before we reached the curb. Gunwoo stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. I stopped beside him, not entirely sure of the choreography of the moment. Whether I was supposed to get in, whether he was coming too, whether there was something that needed to be said, or if we were just going to let the evening fold into itself and pretend it had been ordinary. "Thank you for coming," he said. I looked at him. The streetlight caught the side of his face and threw the other half into shadow, and he looked very young and very not young at the same time, which was a thing about him I hadn't let myself notice before, because noticing things like that felt like making room for something I wasn't prepared to make room for. "You invited me as a joke," I said. He held my gaze. "I know. So why are you thanking me?" He was quiet for a moment. The city noise filled the space between us. A cab horn somewhere, voices from the hotel entrance behind us, the low idle of the Escalade. Then he said, "Because you came anyway." I got in the car. I didn't sleep well that night. The following week was strange in ways that accumulated slowly, like water finding a new level. On Monday, Marcus stopped me in the building service corridor with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not managing it. "The Cho brothers got reassigned," he said, keeping his voice low. "Transferred to the Chicago office, both of them." I didn't say anything. "They were the ones talking in the elevator," he said, in case I'd somehow forgotten. "I know who they were, Marcus." He nodded, looked at the floor, looked back up. "Just thought you should know. I thought about what Gunwoo had said at dinner. That's being handled. I'd told him it didn't need to be. He'd said it was disrespectful and left no room for further discussion. I hadn't thought he'd move that quickly, or that quietly, or that completely." I went back to my office and sat at my desk for a few minutes without opening anything. The thing about power I was learning, or relearning, because somewhere underneath everything I'd already understood this, is that it doesn't announce itself the way movies suggest. It doesn't arrive with raised voices and visible force. The scariest version of it is exactly this. A decision made somewhere out of your sight that rearranges the geography of your life without asking. And by the time you find out about it, the rearranging is already done. 2 people had lost their positions because they'd laughed about me in an elevator. I didn't know how to feel about that. I sat with the discomfort of not knowing, and eventually opened my laptop and answered 11 emails about a plumbing issue on the 14th floor. He didn't summon me or contact me for the rest of that week. I was aware of his presence in the building the way you're aware of weather, not through direct contact, but through atmospheric evidence. His car in the garage on Wednesday morning, a catering company delivering to the penthouse level on Thursday afternoon for what Marcus said was a private meeting. the particular quality of alertness in the lobby when the elevator opened on floors above 30. I kept to my work. I was good at my work. I had systems and routines and a professional identity that existed entirely independently of anything that had happened at the Whitmore Hotel, and I clung to those things with the specific determination of someone who suspects they might be the last stable ground available. And then on Friday afternoon, at 4:47 p.m., my office phone rang. Not my cell. The desk phone, which almost no one used anymore, which rang maybe twice a month with misdirected calls or vendors who'd gotten the number from old paperwork. I picked up mostly from reflex. Ms. Green. The voice was unfamiliar, male, young, professional. Mr. Kwon would like to see you, penthouse level, when you're available. I absorbed the phrase "when you're available" and understood it as the courtesy fiction it was. "I'll be up in 10 minutes, I said. I took 15. Not out of defiance exactly. More because I needed to visit the restroom, check that I looked like a person who had not spent the past week thinking about someone more than was professionally appropriate, and remind myself of several important facts. That I was an employee, functionally. That whatever had happened at the gala was a single event with defined edges. That Gunwoo Kwon operated in a world that had nothing to do with mine, and every reason to stay that way. The penthouse elevator required a separate key card. I had one. I had access to every part of the building. That was the job. But I'd used it maybe 3 times in 2 years. Always for maintenance-related purposes. Always with a contractor in tow. Using it alone, at 5 p.m. on a Friday, felt categorically different. The doors opened into a foyer I'd only half seen before. Clean lines, dark wood. Not ostentatious, but expensive in that specific way that comes from choosing restraint instead of being limited by it. A man I recognized from Gunwoo's security directed me down a short hallway and to the left, into what turned out to be a study or a secondary sitting room. Bookshelves along one wall, a low table with papers, large windows showing the city in late afternoon light that made everything look slightly gilded. Gunwoo was standing at the window with his back to me when I entered. He let a moment pass before he turned. The control of that, the deliberateness of making someone enter a room and wait while you remained still, wasn't lost on me. I stood near the doorway and waited without fidgeting, which cost me something. He turned. He was in a dark shirt instead of a full suit, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and the tattoos continued past his wrist in a way that the suits had always hidden. He looked different. Not less composed. He was incapable of looking less composed, but less armored somehow, like a version of himself that existed closer to the surface. "You know about the Cho brothers," he said. "Yes. You're upset." I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He moved away from the window, not toward me, just shifting his position. "Sit down, Sophia." It was the first time he'd used my name. I registered it like a small physical thing, and carefully did not react to it. I sat in one of the chairs near the low table. He remained standing. "I need to explain something to you," he said. "You don't owe me explanations." "I know." He said it simply, without concession in it. "I'm offering one anyway." He paused. "What I do requires a specific kind of environment, stability. Everyone in my proximity understands certain expectations. People who work for me, directly or otherwise, exist within a structure that has rules. One of those rules is that certain things are not acceptable." He was looking at me directly. Disrespect toward someone I've chosen to include in my sphere is one of those things. Chosen to include in my sphere. The phrase landed with a weight I didn't immediately know how to measure. "I'm the building manager," I said. "I'm not in your sphere." "You were at my table," he said. "You danced with me in a room full of people who are always watching. You are in my sphere, Sophia. Whether or not that was your intention." I held his gaze. "And if I don't want to be?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city continued its indifferent hum. "Then I'll make sure you're left alone," he said. "Completely. No contact, no interference, no consequences for you professionally." He paused. "That's not a threat. I want you to understand the difference." "The difference?" I turned the words over. "And the other option?" I asked. Something in his expression shifted, infinitesimally, but I was watching closely enough now to catch it. "You stay," he said, "as whatever this is. I'm not going to define it in a way that isn't honest yet." His voice was very even. "But you should know that I don't offer things I don't intend to keep. And I don't invite people into spaces they can easily leave." The room was very quiet. I thought about Marcus's face in the corridor, about 2 people reassigned to Chicago because of a conversation in an elevator, about the way the Gala had rearranged around him without his asking, and the way he'd settled his hand at my waist with that deliberate, unhurried certainty, and the way he'd said let them when I'd warned him people would talk. I thought about how I hadn't slept well in a week, and wasn't entirely sure that was a bad thing. "I need to think about it," I said. He nodded. Once, as if he'd expected exactly that answer and found it acceptable. "Take the time you need," he said. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket, which didn't need smoothing, and walked toward the hallway, and made it almost to the foyer before he spoke again. "The dress," he said behind me. "Was it yours?" I stopped, turned slightly. "It was borrowed." "Tell me who owns it," he said. "I'll handle the insurance." I stared at him. "You don't need to." "Sophia. Just my name, quiet and final, like a period at the end of something." I told him Renee's employer. I didn't know why. I left before I could regret it. I took 4 days. Not because I needed 4 days to decide. I think somewhere in the back of my mind, in that quieter and more stubborn part of me, the decision had been made before I left the penthouse. Maybe before that. Maybe it had been made at the top of those 2 steps at the Whitmore, in the moment I refused to look away first. But I took the 4 days anyway because I needed to understand what I was deciding, which is different from making the decision itself. The what was easy. The what it meant was the part that required sitting with. I went through my normal routines, answered emails, handled a dispute between a tenant on 19 and the woman below her about noise complaints, ate dinner at the Thai place on 52nd Street that I'd been going to for 2 years, and that always made me feel like myself. Called my mother on Sunday evening and talked for 40 minutes about nothing important, which was its own kind of necessary. I let the ordinary texture of my life run through my hands like water and asked myself honestly whether I was willing to let it change. Not disappear. Change. Because that was the real question. Gunwoo hadn't offered me anything that required me to give up who I was. At least not explicitly, not in the language he'd used in that room. But I understood enough about proximity to power to know that it changes you regardless of intention. Slowly. In increments too small to track, until one day you look up, and the person you are is standing somewhere the person you were would not have predicted. I'd watched it happen to other people. I'd told myself I was paying attention so it wouldn't happen to me. On Monday morning, I went to work at my normal time. At 9:15, I took the elevator to the penthouse floor. The same man met me in the foyer, led me to the same room. The morning light came through the windows differently, cooler, more direct. And Gunwoo was at the table this time, a coffee in front of him and papers spread to his left that he turned face down without hurry when I entered. He did it naturally, without making a performance of it, the way people manage information that is not meant for certain eyes. I noticed and didn't comment. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "I'll stay," I said. "As whatever this is. That was your language and I'm using it back." Something in his face changed. Not a smile. I was beginning to understand that his face didn't work in those broad, legible expressions. It was subtler. A quality of settling, like a room when the last window has been closed against outside noise. "Okay," he said. "I have conditions," I said. He picked up his coffee. "Tell me." "I keep my job. Not as a courtesy, not as a gesture. I keep it because I'm good at it and it's mine." "Agreed. I don't disappear into this. Whatever this becomes, I have a life that exists outside of it, and that doesn't change." He nodded once. "And the next time you decide to handle something that involves me," I said, "you tell me first, before it's done, not after." He was quiet for a moment. This one felt different from his other silences. Less like he was withholding, and more like he was genuinely considering. "That one is harder," he said finally. "There are things that move quickly. I understand that. I'm not asking for veto power. I'm asking to be told." He looked at me steadily. "I'll try," he said. Which, from him, I was starting to understand, meant something closer to a promise than the word suggested. I sat down across from him. The morning city moved beyond the windows, indifferent and enormous, all glass and gray and distance. I put my hands flat on the table and looked at them for a second. My hands, familiar and ordinary, the hands of a woman who managed maintenance requests and reviewed vendor contracts, and ate dinner alone at a Thai restaurant on 52nd Street. "I need you to understand something, too," I said. I looked up at him. "I'm not afraid of you." He held my gaze. "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I know what you are." I said, "I'm not pretending. I'm not telling myself a version of this that makes it easier. I know what your world looks like, and I know what it costs, and I'm still sitting here." I paused. "But I'm sitting here as myself, not as someone who got absorbed into your orbit and forgot who she was before. That's the version of me you're getting, or you're not getting any version." The silence after that felt different from any silence I'd experienced in this room before. Fuller, like it was holding something. "I don't want any other version," he said quietly. And the way he said it, without decoration, without the performance of sincerity, just the plain flat weight of a true thing being stated, was the moment I understood that this was real. Not easy, not safe, not the kind of thing I could trace a clear path through, but real. 3 weeks later, Renee called me. "Sophia," she said, and her voice had that particular quality of someone who has just learned something that rearranged their understanding of the world. "The dress. What about it?" "Someone purchased it," she said. "The collector sold it. I just found out." I was sitting at my desk, a Tuesday afternoon, reading through a contract amendment. "Who purchased it?" She named a holding company I didn't recognize. I wrote it down. I looked it up later when she was off the phone, following the ownership chain through 3 layers of incorporation before I stopped, because I didn't need to follow it any further. I sat with that for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and sent a text to a number I now had saved. "You bought the dress." 3 minutes passed. Then, "It needed to belong to the person wearing it." I read that sentence 4 times. I set the phone down on my desk and looked out the window at the building across the street, at the ordinary mid-afternoon light falling on ordinary brick, at the city going about its enormous, indifferent business. And I felt something move in my chest, complicated and specific, not quite joy, and not quite fear, but something that lived in the territory between them, where most things worth anything seemed to reside. I picked the phone back up. "That's not handling something without telling me first," I wrote. The reply came faster this time. That one wasn't about handling anything. That was something else. I didn't answer right away. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and returned to the contract amendment on my screen, and let the afternoon proceed the way afternoons do. In small increments, quietly, one thing following another. But underneath all of it, steady and low, something that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago continued to move, like a current in dark water, present whether or not I looked at it, going somewhere I hadn't been yet. At 5:30, I closed my laptop. I put on my coat. I took the elevator down through the building, past floors where I knew the names of the tenants, past maintenance closets I'd personally supervised the restocking of, past all the ordinary and accumulated evidence of a life I'd built carefully and on my own terms. In the lobby, one of Gunwoo's men was standing near the door, not blocking it, not approaching me. Just there. His eyes met mine briefly and then moved away, and I understood that this was the new shape of certain things. That there were people now who knew where I was and watched the perimeter of the space I occupied, not because I'd asked for it, not because I was in danger, but because someone had decided I was worth that kind of attention and had acted on the decision without making a speech about it. 6 weeks ago, I would have walked past him and felt only the strangeness of being seen in a way I hadn't consented to. Tonight I walked past him and felt something harder to name. Something that sat closer to being known. Outside, the city was doing what it always did in early evening. That particular shift when the light goes amber and the sidewalks fill with people going somewhere. Everyone moving with the specific purpose of a life in progress. I stood for a moment on the steps and breathed the cool air and thought about a woman who had received an invitation as a joke and had stood at the top of 2 steps in a borrowed dress and refused to look away. I thought, she isn't borrowed anymore. The dress belonged to me now. So did the choice I'd made in a quiet room with morning light coming through the windows. Not because I'd been swept into something larger than myself. Not because I'd been afraid or dazzled or outmaneuvered. But because I'd looked at the full shape of the thing and decided, with both eyes open, that I wanted to see where it led. I went down the steps and turned left and walked into the amber evening, and the city closed around me the way it always did, enormous and indifferent and full of lives proceeding on their own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt entirely, precisely like one of them.